Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning, everyone. This is Genomics Aotearoa seminar series, the first one for the year. And so I'm really delighted to see that tons of you have stampeded by. That's really great to see you here. If you don't know who Genomics Aotearoa is, we have a fantastic website which is up on the slide at the moment. Go and have a look, and then write to Claire, who's done all the hard work putting that up. So make sure you have a look at it. But if you wish to be on our mailing list, then there is a link on the website. You can click on the link and you'll be told about all our fantastic seminar series coming up. And we have an outstanding seminar today, but we have a lot of international and national speakers in the next few months. And we're also joining up with the Genetic Society of Australasia to run a seminar series, which will include Japan and China and various other places. So there's some big things coming up in the rest of the year, but the highlight of the year is actually today. So I'm glad you're here today. So today's speaker is Professor Alice Roberts. Alice, I'm going to call you Alice because Professor Alice just doesn't. Has been a professor of public engagement and science at the University of Birmingham since 2012. You probably have seen Alice on her hundreds of television programs covering biology, archaeology, history, and you might have seen The Incredible Human Journey, Origins of Us, and Prehistoric Autopsy. She's also, and this is, I think, the really cool stuff that she's been doing, is writing popular science books, and I've been fascinated by those in the past few years. So there is a new book coming out in May 2022 called Buried, an Alternative History of the First Millennium in Britain. But there's one called Ancestors, I think, which I read over the holidays, which was awesome. And those books are available in bookshops here in New Zealand. Please go out and buy them from a bookshop. But if you can't, then obviously you can get them from Amazon and various other awful places like that. Alice was awarded the Royal Society's first David Attenborough Prize for Public Engagement in 2020, which I think is a huge achievement. And the reason why I was really keen to get Alice to come and talk to us is that she works in an intersection between biology and archaeology and history, and that includes genomics. So I think some of the most thoughtful things about the genomics of early British history, I think, is contained in some of her books. Now, obviously, historical archaeological inquiry into human remains is challenging for different Indigenous and religious cult communities across the world, and that's particularly true here in the Pacific and here in Aotearoa. So it's important that we recognise those challenges and think about how that kind of work can take into account the cultural norms and the societies that we have around the world. And I just wanted to mention that because I think it's important to recognise that this kind of work is done in different contexts around the world, and those contexts are really important. I'd also like to point out that in this talk, there will be some slides of human remains, so I hope you are forewarned if that makes you feel uncomfortable. So Alice's talk will explore how burial archaeology sheds light on prehistoric societies and how genetics is revolutionising what we know about our deep past. So Alice, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. Of course, it's the middle or getting close to the middle of the night for you. So hopefully you're not too exhausted. And by the end of it, there will be a lot of extremely grateful New Zealanders. We're desperate to hear international speakers at this time. So take it away, Alice.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for that lovely introduction. So now I'm going to share my screen and get some slides up for you to see. So as Peter said, my current book, or my latest book, is Ancestors, and that is the prehistory of Britain told through burial archaeology. So I chose 7 key burials to take us through that period. And also, as Peter said, I'm writing about this at the moment because it's such an exciting time that, you know, we are now in the era of archaeogenomics. We're not sequencing just little bits of ancient genomes, we're sequencing entire ancient genomes, and there is so much in terms of new revelations coming out because of that. And so I've just finished writing the follow-up to Ancestors, which you can buy, but you won't have it in your hands for a while. It's actually out in the shops in May, but that is the next millennium. So it's British archaeology again. So it starts in the Roman period, just as Britain falls under Roman rule, and looks at some very interesting burial archaeology that comes over with the Romans, and then carries on into what we used to call the Dark Ages, the centuries after Roman rule, so the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, when we also think that there was perhaps a group of people who are known popularly as the Anglo-Saxons coming over, but there doesn't seem to be much genetic evidence of that. So that's rather interesting too. And there's a few Vikings in there too. So as I said, that's out in May. So I love walking in the British landscape. I love walking in landscapes everywhere and looking for traces of ancient inhabitants, looking for archaeology in the landscape. And we're very lucky in Britain that we have this kind of very obvious archaeology that goes back for thousands of years. Here we've got a beautiful long barrow. So that's dating from the Neolithic, about 6,000 years ago, and is probably a memorialization of a house. We've realized quite recently that these long barrows have often burnt down houses in the center of them. And then later on, they become used and repurposed and then built specifically for the purpose of burial. So they are communal tombs. These are lovely images by my friend, the landscape photographer, David Attenborough. He's got loads of them on his website. He goes out with his drone to take photographs in the morning and in the evening. You get these lovely sun colors, but also those raking shadows. And as I'm walking in these landscapes, I often feel that there are ghosts in the landscape with me, that there is this real kind of visceral presence of people who've lived in places which are very familiar to me now, hundreds, thousands of years ago. So I have this kind of feeling of going on a pilgrimage with these walks where I'm seeking out particular monuments in the landscape. And I'm a humanist, so I don't actually believe in any kind of life after death, and I certainly don't believe in ghosts in any real way, other than here we have very obvious physical traces of our ancestors in the environment, and for me that is meaningful enough. So in the past we had a kind of thriving tradition amongst antiquarians, who are the predecessors of archaeologists, of seeking out tombs and digging them up. So they might look at tombs like these, which are very typical Bronze Age round barrows, and go, right, we're definitely going to take a spade to that and see what's inside it. Now, we don't tend to do that anymore. And modern archaeologists will try to preserve archaeology and especially tombs in situ. But we do get new discoveries turning up, often associated with developers making new roads, constructing new housing estates, schools, whatever it is. And then we have those burials coming to light again. So in the book, I've written about some finds from antiquity, so going back into the 19th century when the antiquarians were very keen to find burials, and some more recent ones as well, in fact. So the first one I want to talk to you about is one of those that was discovered by an antiquarian, and it comes from these incredible cliffs on the coast of South Wales. So this is the Gower in South Wales. And I think you'll be able to see just on the right-hand side of that gully on those cliffs, you can see a little triangular or teardrop-shaped dark hole. And that is Buckland Cave. And that's where the first burial comes from that I want to talk to you about. And this burial takes us way back into the Old Stone Age, into the Paleolithic, and right back into the depths of the Ice Age as well. So it's a story about very early burials. And in fact, this is the earliest burial that's ever been discovered in Britain. But it's also a really interesting story about the development of archaeology as a discipline and a clash between science and religion that was happening in those early years of archaeology and geology as well. I visited Buckland Cave for the first time back in 2005 when I was making a series for the BBC called Coast. And when we were thinking about stories that we wanted to include in that series, I definitely wanted to include Buckland Cave because it is very iconic as Britain's first burial. And it's just a great story. I mean, the story of the burial itself, which takes us so far back into time, but also the story of the antiquarian who discovered it. And here I am descending this rocky path. So it starts off as a kind of grassy path, and then you're very quickly down onto rocks. And I'm with a friend and colleague, Paul Pett, who I've taught with at Bristol University, where I used to work before I moved to Birmingham University. And I'm a biological anthropologist. So my specialty is anatomy and specifically bones when it comes to ancient human remains. And Paul is a much more general archaeologist with an interest in dating, not that kind of dating, the sort where you pin a date on archaeological remains. So when we talked together, we divided up the human evolution course at the University of Bristol into stones and bones, and Paul did the stones and I did the bones. Here we are then making our way onto this beach, which is a very rocky beach. It's limestone, and you can see the way that the waves here have carved the limestone into these really wonderful, almost Gaudi-esque pinnacles. It's quite hard to walk on. And you can only approach the cave itself at low tide. So we're getting down on these rocks at low tide, and then there's a short walk across a stretch of sand, and then you're back up onto rocks the other side, and you can scramble up to Paviland Cave itself and have a look inside, as the Reverend William Buckland did back in the 19th century. So William Buckland is a fascinating character. He was an early pioneer of geology and paleontology and a bit of archaeology as well. He was the University of Oxford's first chair of geology. In fact, he invented that position for himself. And he was extremely interested in looking for bones of large extinct animals. And this was in the the first half of the 19th century. He was kind of right at the forefront of geology, but what he was trying to do was stop geology being a challenge for Christianity. So he was trying to bring geology and Christianity together, and he was trying to do that in such a way that he was looking for evidence that he thought could support various stories in the Bible. So he was preaching the Bible. I mean, it sounds crazy to us today, and it sounds like the sort of thing a young earth creationist would do. But at the time, I think it was quite reasonable, and he was a good scientist. He's preaching the Bible as a historical document, and he's saying, well, perhaps we're being told in the Bible about big events that happened, for instance, the global inundation, Noah's flood. And can we see evidence of that in the landscape? He thought he could. He thought he could see evidence in the British landscape in particular for a catastrophic inundation. And he also recognized that there were bones of extinct animals, or now extinct animals, in Britain that were found in various caves and in layers of rock. And he interpreted those remains as being animals that had existed in what's now Britain before the flood, and that what had wiped them out, what had extinguished them, was the flood itself. So, for instance, he found hyena bones in a cave in Yorkshire and said, these are obviously animals that no longer live in Britain, and they were wiped out locally by Noah's flood. Well, I knew that he'd excavated at Paviland Cave in South Wales, but what I didn't know was that actually he had been alerted to the antiquity of this cave by some women. Now, women do tend to get written out of science history. There weren't as many women scientists in the past, and those that were around seem to have been selectively forgotten. So something I really wanted to do in Ancestors was to memorialize those women and tell their story as well. So the landowner of the Gower, Lady Mary Cole, was an enthusiastic geologist herself, an enthusiastic botanist, and her daughters, the Mrs. Talbots, were also very interested in archaeology, and they followed Buckland's publications. So they heard of his hyena den in Yorkshire, and they wrote to him, and all these letters are available to read. They're on the internet. If you go to National Museum Wales, you can read all of this correspondence between the Reverend William Buckland and Lady Mary Cole and her daughters. And they said, they wrote to Buckland and they said, look, we've got these caves on the Gower where there are bones of large extinct creatures, possibly. And so Buckland was very interested. He wrote back to them and said, could you actually go and do some investigation? And Mary Teresa Talbot, one of Lady Mary Cole's daughters, did just that and came away from the cave with basketfuls of bones and teeth and various other objects. And she sent one tooth off to William Buckland, and he said, yes, that is a bone of a bear. So an animal that no longer exists in Britain. So I am interested, and I'm going to come down. Don't let anybody else into that cave before I get there. So they sealed it off, and that was in late 1822. And in January 1823, William Buckland made his way down to Gower and did his own excavation in the cave, along with Mary Theresa Talbot. And he found bones of mammoths. So he found what he described as elephant bones, but he also found, unexpectedly, a human burial. So if we home in on this picture, it shows a human burial next to a mammoth skull. And this is a picture that was published in his big book on the relics of the flood, Reliqui Diluviani. Now, this skeleton is shown quite complete, and that's rather optimistic and exaggerated, because that's actually how much of a skeleton was left in the cave. And those bones now reside in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And you can see that what you've got is, it looks a bit scrappy at first, but you have got most of the left side of a skeleton. And you've got some really important pieces like the pelvis, which are very good for determining the biological sex of that individual. What you can also see is all those bones are stained red, which is really weird, because this is a limestone cave with a yellowish loam floor. There's nothing naturally red in that cave. So they seem to have been stained red with ochre, which has come into that cave with the burial itself. And there were lots of objects with that burial as well. So there are these shells which have been pierced through, presumably to be suspended, so either worn on a necklace or sewn onto clothes, again stained with red ochre. There are fragments of ivory rods, curious objects, and the longest is about 10 centimeters long, and again all stained with red ochre, but these have been carved out from mammoth bone. So what did Buckland think of this skeleton then? Well, first of all, he thought it was the skeleton of a man, and he thought it was probably a very recent skeleton. So he suggested to Lady Mary Cole that it might have been the skeleton of a murdered exciseman, so a murdered tax collector. At the time, there were lots of well-documented fights between excisemen and smugglers along the coasts of South Wales and also around places like Cornwall, where there were caves where smugglers could keep their loot, and then the tax men would come and find those caves and end up getting into a scuffle with the smugglers. And William Buckland suggested that this was a tax collector who had met a sticky end. So he was already thinking that this was a very recent individual. He could not conceive of the possibility that these human remains could have been as old as the mammoth bones, because as far as he was concerned, modern humans didn't live in Britain at the same time as mammoths. So he was happy that humans existed by that time, but existed only in the Middle East, which he considered to be the cradle of humanity, and that it was only after the flood that humans would have spread into Europe. And so this can't be an individual that was around at the same time as the mammoths, as far as he was concerned. His first story about smugglers and excisemen was quickly turned over. So he starts writing to Lady Mary Cole again when he's back in Oxford. And he says, actually, I think these are the bones of a woman. And he never really explains why. But I think it was probably because he was looking at the ivory objects that the individual was buried with, and he could not get his head around the prospect that a man could be buried with jewelry, what he was interpreting as jewelry. So there were those rods, things which look like beads, things which look like bangles as well. And then he just enters onto this complete flight of fancy, and writes to Lady Mary Cole and says, you should write a novel about this woman. She's the Red Witch of Paviland, the Red Woman. And she was keeping some kind of gambling den in that cave. And then he's interpreting the ivory objects maybe as gaming counters as well. So his imagination just runs wild. By this time, he's kind of shifted to thinking that maybe the bones are a bit older, and maybe they might be 2,000 years old, so possibly Iron Age into the Roman period. And he's basically wrong about everything, because he's wrong about the sex of these bones. He's wrong about the age of these bones. We can perhaps forgive him the age of the bones because he's operating in the 19th century and he doesn't have any means of absolute dating as we do now with radiocarbon dating. But they were in the same layer as the mammoth bones. So I don't think he should have been so quick to disregard the idea that they could have been synchronous with the mammoth bones, and that in fact what he was looking at was an example of a very, very early human. It didn't fit into his thesis, though. It didn't fit into his ideas about Noah's flood, and so he couldn't accept it. If we look at the pelvis close up, what we can see on this pelvis is on the lower part of it there's a notch into the pelvis, that kind of deep notch, and that is the greater sciatic notch. Now that notch, if this was a female pelvis, would be a wide open kind of C shape. And as you can see, it's actually quite narrow. It's a J shape. So this is a very obviously male pelvis. And there are lots of other features as well, which say that it's male. It is still called the Red Lady of Paviland. So Buckland's ideas about it being female have firmly stuck. And we still refer to this burial as the Red Lady of Paviland. And we now know a bit more about the age of it. So we know that actually this burial takes us right back into the Paleolithic, and Paul Pett was one of the team that did the radiocarbon dating of this burial. Early radiocarbon dates in the 1970s came back as about 18,000 years ago, and that took everyone's breath away, but it couldn't have worked. It wasn't an acceptable date. And that's because there were ice sheets right down over Britain at that time, and Britain was uninhabitable. It was very close to the peak of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum. So those radiocarbon dates were kind of put on one side for a while. And then when radiocarbon dating became more sophisticated and more accurate, and people like Paul Pett were doing it in the 80s and the 90s, they redated the Red Lady of Paviland. Initially, the bones came out at 31,000 years old, and then were pushed back to 33,000 years old. So this is incredibly ancient. This is pushing us right back into the Paleolithic, into this period known as the Gravettian in terms of the archaeology. And looking out through the cave mouth in this wonderful reconstruction painting, we can see that there's no sea there. So now that you'd be looking out at the Severn Estuary, but back then, over 30,000 years ago, you're looking at a wide grassy plain, because so much water is locked up as ice that sea levels are 100 meters lower than they are today, and the actual coast is some 70 miles further out west. The artist here has imagined how this man may have been buried, and has suggested that perhaps people are pouring ochre into the grave. That's a reasonable suggestion, that ochre's getting there somehow. Maybe it was sprinkled in, maybe it represents blood, we don't know. It could have been dyeing clothes, though, so it could have been used already to stain the clothes that this man was wearing, or it could have been painted onto his skin. So there are various different ways that ochre could arrive. You can also see that the artist here has represented those ivory wands as long wands of ivory, those ivory rods rather, as long wands of ivory. We don't really know what they were. They may have been blanks for beads, we're not sure. They're very, very curious, but they're very deliberately made, and they were obviously meaningful because there were so many fragments of them in the grave. Now, if you go to Paviland Cave today and you don't get in and out in the few hours that you've got around low tide to do it, you get quite wet, and you can see that the water came right up to the top of my thighs when we came out, because we were filming, and because there's always just a little bit more to do when you're filming. So we didn't quite make it out before the sea came back in, but none of us were stranded, at least. We didn't lose a television camera at that point. Back 30,000 years ago, 33,000 years ago, we wouldn't have got our feet wet at all, of course, because the coast was so much further out. And what you see is sea now lapping around the cliffs of Paviland Cave. That would have all have been this big grassy plain, and that would have been full of Pleistocene fauna. So it would have been full of the mammoths that were roaming those plains, full of deer, full of horses, all of these herds of animals that were hunted by the Red Lady of Paviland and his tribe. These were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers burying one of their dead in this cave. And we wonder why, because we don't see many of these burials. Interestingly, the style of that burial links up with other burials across Europe and beyond, as far as Russia, where, again, people are buried with red ochre in the grave and with ivory objects and with bones of large megafauna as well. but there are not many burials from this period. So what we're seeing is something really unusual in the treatment of the dead. We don't know how most of the dead are being treated, and they may have been given sky burials, for instance, where bodies are left out to be excarnated, to be picked clean by carrion and other scavengers. Whatever's happening, they're not entering the archaeological record. It's only these very few burials that do in the Gravettian. And so we wonder then what was special about those people, why they were picked out in that way. And I think we tend to first assume that there's something special about them in a positive way, that this might have been a leader or a champion or a shaman, perhaps, for his community. But we should remember that this might have been a bad death as well. So maybe this is somebody that was killed in a hunting accident, for instance. And because of that, his death has to be memorialized in a specific way to somehow alleviate the worries about that bad death, and perhaps to stop his spirit coming back to haunt the living. We don't know, but we have to consider all of the possibilities. I'm now going to take you to some more cliffs. These ones are far away from the coast, or not too far away, actually. You can just about see the coast in the background, and some more caves. So this is the Mendip Hills, just south of where I live in North Somerset. And within these hills, there's a massive gorge that was carved out during the Ice Age. And in that gorge, there are some quite famous caves that are a real kind of tourist honeypot. And people are constantly visiting these caves to see the natural wonders like this, wonderful stalagmites and stalactites and these reflective pools. Now, people have been visiting those caves as tourists for centuries, going way back into the 18th century at least, when we know that there were women living in the caves who were doing tours and selling minerals and flowers as a way to supplement their income from the tours. And then as we get into the 19th century, the caves are taken over and managed by a couple of rivals. There was a man called Cox who looked after one cave and a man called Goff who looked after the other cave. And Richard Goff was determined that his cave was going to be the main attraction in Cheddar Gorge. So determined that he went to Weston-super-Mare, just down the road, and came back with cartloads of extra stalagmites and stuck them on. So he accentuated the natural beauty of those caves with these additions. He also used dynamite to blast through into extra chambers, making the caves even bigger and better. And eventually he won, and Goff's cave did become the star attraction. And it still is today, actually. So if you go to Cheddar Gorge, then it's very much Goff's cave that most people go to. And Cox's cave is worth a visit, but it's a bit of an afterthought. His sons carried on his underground empire after Richard Goff's death. And in the early 20th century, they were doing a little bit of work in the cave entrance, and they were digging out some drainage channels because it was always flooding. And they found some human remains. Now, some of those human remains were part of a quite articulated skeleton, so it looked like a burial. And the other human remains were more fragmentary and smashed up. So here are some of those really smashed up human remains, including some skulls. And here is the face of the individual in the more articulated burial. And this face has been reconstructed on the skull by my friends, the Dutch paleo artists, the Kennis brothers. And if you're interested in this kind of reconstructive art, then do visit their website. If you just Google Kennis brothers, it will come up. They've done lots and lots of hominins, so very, very ancient humans. And we worked on a book together called Evolution, the Human Story, which was a big illustrated book for Dorling Kindersley, where they did the reconstructions of all of these faces of ancient hominins from Australopithecines through to Homo erectus, and then more recent individuals as well. But here is the Kennis brothers' reconstruction of the individual who's become known as Cheddar Man, not surprisingly. And they've reconstructed him here using standard skin thicknesses across his skull, which was well preserved. But they've actually had some help with the skin tone and the hair color and the eye color. Normally, again, they're using a little bit of artistic license when it comes to those things, and just thinking about the diversity that we know existed amongst ancient humans. But in fact, here they've had a bit of help from geneticists, because Cheddar Man has had his genome sequenced, and it's probabilistic, of course, when it comes to appearance, but we think it most likely that he had quite dark skin, blue eyes, striking combination, and then very, very dark brown hair. So he doesn't look like anybody who we would consider to be British for a long time today. You know, most people who've got a heritage in Britain which goes back a few centuries, a few generations, have much paler skin. And I think it just reminds us that very different looking people have lived in the places that we now call home over the centuries. But there are those smashed up bones as well. And actually, these are slightly older than Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man has been dated, and his bones came out at around 10,000 years old. That places him after the peak of the last ice age, when the ice sheets had retreated, and we start to get hunter-gatherers coming back into Britain at that period in time. They are still hunter-gatherers. It's still a while before farming arrives in Britain. And so they are living by gathering wild plants and hunting wild animals. And Cheddar Man was interred quite carefully, buried quite carefully by, we presume, his relatives and his friends. Not so these other bones. So these smashed up bones are a little bit older. They're a couple of thousand years older, still Mesolithic, so about 12,000 years old. And this is a radius, and it has been broken open. You can see it's been smashed open. And Dr. Sylvia Bello, working at the Natural History Museum, has pored over hundreds of bone fragments from Gough's Cave and has looked at the way that they've been smashed open, and is absolutely sure that these are smashed open not by rock falls in the cave or by any other natural means, but by humans, and with clear intent. Because if you are smashing open long bones like this, then you're trying to get at what's inside the long bone, and what's inside the long bone is marrow, which is very nutritious. So Sylvia Bello believes that this is evidence of nutritional cannibalism. So in other words, humans eating humans. There's something odd as well, ritualistic, going on with these bones. It doesn't seem to be purely about nutrition. You can see a kind of zigzag incision on the surface of this bone over on the right-hand side. And there's another object, which is potentially a ritual object as well. There's a couple of these. And these are the skulls, which have actually been quite carefully chipped away at to remove the base of the skull and most of the facial bones as well, and create a kind of bowl. So these are described as being skull cups. And they're very, very curious objects. Sylvia Bello very much sees these as ritual objects. And so perhaps this cannibalism is being done in a very ritualistic way. I think whenever we see evidence like this of cannibalism in the past, with bones being smashed open, cut marks on long bones as well, where ligaments and muscles have been cut away, our perhaps again immediate assumption is that this has been done either in extremis, because people are starving, because why else would you eat somebody, or it's being done in a way to insult the dead. Perhaps these are the bones of people who from a conquered tribe, and the victors are eating them to express their victory, to really kind of stamp that in place. But this is prehistory. We can't get into the minds of these people. They didn't write anything down. And we have to accept the possibility that actually what's happening here is very respectful. It could be. It could be that eating the dead is what you do normally. It's what you do to your relatives. And really, we have to be very clear where we leave the scientific evidence behind and then start moving into conjecture. I don't think it means that we shouldn't conjecture and we shouldn't have hypotheses, but what we have to do is have many hypotheses. And I think with archaeology this old, that it's unlikely that we'll ever get to the truth. So we'll keep all of those hypotheses alive, all of those potential diagnoses going. So this could have been respectful cannibalism. It could have been disrespectful cannibalism. It seems to have been about obtaining nutrition, certainly. That's why they're smashing into those bones. And the skull cup, we don't know what that was used for. my friend Paul Pettit has a more mundane explanation for this skull cup. And he says, well, if you're eating a dead body, you've got to have something to hold the blood in. So there you go. Moving on to the Neolithic, which is a fascinating time. I think the biggest revolution that humans have ever experienced, when we see farming arriving in Britain. It's, as far as Britain is concerned, it starts in the Middle East. It starts around the Fertile Crescent around 11,000 years ago, and then spreads westwards right across Europe, reaching British and Irish shores by about 6,000 years ago. And whoever it is that's doing that farming is also burying their dead in very different ways as well, creating amazing tombs like this one at Newgrange in Ireland, and like the other long barrows, like the one I showed you right at the beginning. Farming, as far as New Zealand is concerned, the ideas about farming and the crops and the animals are going to arrive from East Asia, and there was a completely separate locus of the origins of agriculture in East Asia that happens around the same time as the locus in the Middle East. And I suspect, although the dates are slightly later in Central America, I suspect that they will be pushed back a bit earlier, and we'll find that actually this is a response to climate change all around the world, that we've got different communities in different places responding by taking control of their food by starting to farm it rather than simply gathering wild plants and animals. This is a very famous Stone Age just into Bronze Age monument in Britain. You might recognize it. Perhaps you will do better if I show you this angle from David Abrams' drone. So this is the very famous site of Stonehenge, the most famous Stone Age and Bronze Age site in Britain. And just down the road from that is the last burial that I quickly want to tell you about tonight. So this is a burial that dates to the Bronze Age. Completely unexpected. When the archaeologists were excavating, they actually didn't think they were going to find anything. They'd done some scans, they'd done some geophysics in a site that was destined to become a new school just on the outskirts of a town called Amesbury, close to Stonehenge. But when they started to strip the soil back, they quickly found that actually they were dealing with a couple of Roman cemeteries and then also some Bronze Age burials. And these particular Bronze Age burials, they started to dig them on a Friday and realized that they were burials and not just big pits. And then they had to keep on, because once you've opened a burial up, you've really got to keep going. Otherwise, the bones will become degraded very quickly. And also they knew that there were lots of objects in this grave as well that they needed to retrieve and not just leave it open over the weekend. They'd seen some pottery and they recognized the pottery as being Bronze Age. So they knew that they were dealing with a burial which was over 4,000 years old. And when they'd finished, they realized that it was the most richly furnished Bronze Age burial from Britain that had ever been found. And you can see some of the objects that are scattered around it there. Here they are shown in Salisbury Museum, where this skeleton is on display, although many of these objects actually are currently in the British Museum in the new Stonehenge exhibition. And you can see how many objects there are, and that's not even showing the pottery. So you had 5 pots around that burial as well. The objects included things like these beautifully carved stone wrist guards. One of them was alongside this individual's forearm, and the other one was simply placed in the grave. And those wrist guards are something to do with these other objects in the grave. And these are just some of the 18 beautiful tanged arrowheads that were also placed in the archer's grave. We call him the Amesbury Archer because of all these arrowheads. When these arrowheads were placed in the grave, we presume that they were attached to shafts, but all of that organic material, the wood, the bindings, the resin, has rotted away. And we're just left with a stone. But we've also got some metal artifacts as well in his grave. And these are some of the earliest metal artifacts in Britain, anywhere in Britain, because we're talking about the very, very earliest part of the Bronze Age, which actually now we're tending to call the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic, because people were not quite blending together copper and tin to make bronze yet, but they were using copper on its own. So there are those knife blades alongside reconstructions of what those knives might have looked like. They look lovely, but they're not really as useful as flint. So I think this is really interesting. They're obviously prestige items unusual because they're metal in a time when few people would have seen metal, and that, you know, soft-edged compared with the flint knives that everybody would have been using on a daily basis. So I think it's much more about what they look like than actually the function of them. There were some other metal objects in the grave as well. The archaeologists had spotted those on that Friday evening. They'd seen that glint of gold. And these objects are very distinctly British in character, but actually they are similar to other objects that are found in Western Europe. And there is a culture, a common culture across Central and Western Europe and into Britain at this period of time. It's a culture that gets its name from the pottery that is associated with the burials. And on the continent, in continental Europe, it tends to be called the bell beaker culture. And in Britain, it's called the beaker culture. And there's been this almost endless argument about where this beaker culture comes from and whether you've just got a few people coming over to Britain, bringing the ideas of that culture with them, and that cultural idea really kind of spreading and catching on, or whether it is a big wave of people, a big migration of people coming into Britain. And actually, the archaeologists could have just carried on arguing about that with no resolution in sight, because if all we've got to go on is the artifacts, then all we can see is a new culture appearing in Britain, a culture which has links to the continent, but we're not sure how that link works. And it really is only in the era of archaeogenomics that we've been able to come close to resolving that question. And I believe we are now at that point. So a very large study carried out in 2018 or published in 2018 showed that there was a big migration into Britain during the early Bronze Age. So this study involved sequencing genomes from hundreds of individuals across Europe in the preceding Neolithic and then in the Bronze Age. So that's the key to it. If we have genomes from the Neolithic farmers in Britain, and then we can look at the genomes of Bronze Age people like the Amesbury Archer, we can compare the two. And what they tell us is that over a period of about 300 years, there was a 90% population replacement. So we actually know from genomics that there was a big wave of migration into Britain during the Neolithic as well. So again, that idea of farming didn't arrive as just a few people bringing the idea with their crops and their animals, but actually arrived as a big population movement. And we've got a similar thing happening in the early Bronze Age, and published just recently, we've got another big migration in the Middle Bronze Age. So we're starting now to get these signals of migrations in the past that we've not had before. We've not been able to get at this data, and it really is archaeogenomics which is allowing us to see that. Now, what archaeogenomics doesn't do is tell us how that transition happened. And as soon as that paper was published, there were inflationary headlines in British newspapers saying things like Dutch hordes killed off the people who built Stonehenge, which is just racing to a conclusion, because what we know from the science is that we've got a 90% population replacement over 300 years. It could be much quicker. It could have happened over a few decades. We don't know. We need finer resolution in the data. We also don't know whether it was violent. So saying that the Dutch hordes, I mean, that doesn't make sense because the Netherlands didn't exist as a country then, but saying these hordes of people killed off the builders of Stonehenge, we don't have any evidence of a peak in violence around the start of the Bronze Age either. So it moves our whole understanding of the early Bronze Age along, but it throws open a whole load of new questions. And really the ball's back in the archaeologist's court now to look at how that Bronze Age transition works out on the ground. And that needs to be done region by region, locality by locality. And then hopefully we will have some more genomes coming through so we can resolve just how quickly that transition happened. But it's a very, very exciting time for archaeology at the moment, with these questions that just haven't been answerable before, now finally answerable through genetics. And the Amesbury Archer himself has finally yielded up some DNA. His DNA has been very, very difficult to analyze, but it's just being published this coming month in March. And I think you're in March already. I'm not in March quite yet. I'm still stuck in the past. But the Amesbury Archer has got within his DNA signals of that migration. It's an extraordinary migration. It actually starts in the Pontic steppe, so above the Black Sea, in horse herders on the Pontic steppe. And this population expands and then expands right across Europe, not in a single generation, nothing like that, but generation by generation, it expands across Europe and eventually gets to Britain. And when it gets to Britain, the cultural signal that arrives with it is that of the Beaker people, and the beginning of the Bronze Age. His skeleton's interesting in other ways. This is actually an MRI scan of a patient, or a CT scan of a patient, looking down on the top of the shoulder. And you can see that there's a kind of separate bit of bone right on the corner there. And that's an unfused tip of the scapula. It's called an os acromiale. That might be associated with heavy use of the shoulder during his teenage years. So perhaps that is from archery. He's also got some pathology around the knee. And as a biological anthropologist with a specialty in paleopathology, this is what really kind of interests me, looking at these bones and seeing evidence of disease like this. And these bones were investigated by Jackie McKinley of Wessex Archaeology. And she noted the fact that there is a missing kneecap. So you can see that there's a kneecap on the right side and the kneecap's just not there on the left. And this isn't sloppy archaeologists. It actually wasn't there. You can also see, I think, that the tibia and the fibula on the left side, which are the higher up as we're looking at those bones, are really thin compared with the tibia and the fibula on the right. So those bones on the left side have actually withered away a bit. Perhaps he had a penetrating injury to the knee and lost his kneecap in that penetrating injury. He certainly would have been afflicted by this. He would have walked with a limp. And I think it's absolutely fascinating that this man with a very obvious disability was given the most high status burial that we've ever seen in the British Bronze Age. His disability didn't detract from his high status. Who knows? Perhaps it even contributed to it. Perhaps he was known as somebody who'd survived against the odds. His teeth have also yielded some interesting surprises. So teeth bear the geological signature of the place that we grew up. We make our enamel of our teeth when we're children, and it just stays there for our entire lives. When his enamel was analysed, the oxygen and strontium isotopes in it tell us that he grew up somewhere around the Alps, 800 miles away from where he was buried on Salisbury Plain. So he is a migrant himself. He is a newcomer to Britain. He is perhaps part of this big migration to Britain and this new culture that arrives at the beginning of the Bronze Age. So I just want to leave you with that image of him lying in his grave. I've drawn him here on the day of his burial, with the arrows placed over his knees, with the 5 pots around him and all those other objects in this timber-lined grave. He's there, a warrior smith from the dawn of the Copper Age 43 centuries ago, a metal-bending, bow-wielding, time-travelling magician. Thank you very much for listening to my tales of ancient ancestors.
Thank you so much. It's one of the really appalling things about Zoom talks is that nobody claps. So I'm doing the clapping. You can imagine the thunderous applause.
Thank you, Peter.
That was really fascinating and I mean delightful to see and to think that that our field is really starting to make an impact on understanding some of these burials that really have been known about for some time, but you know, get light on them. Okay, I think we should draw this to a close. So I'd just like to thank Alice again for a fascinating talk. That was really interesting, and thank you for kicking off our seminar series in such a spectacular way.
Thank you for having me in New Zealand. It's lovely to have been with you this evening, this morning. Next time, we'll get you over and you can actually talk to some of the people who are doing similar sorts of work here and do that cross-fertilization that's really important for all disciplines. So our next seminar is on Friday, March the 11th. It's from Emily Coote, which is on the genome-wide analysis of hoki, which is a sort of fish, if you don't know, and looking at fish populations and what we can learn from genomic analyses. Thank you very much for coming. We'll hope to see you at the next Genomics Aotearoa seminar. As I said, if you wish to
subscribe. There's a subscribe linky on our website. Again, thank you, Alice. That was awesome, and I'll do the clapping for everyone else, and hopefully see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.